and then add to the chat any elements of culture. Thanks for typing that question in there, Jenny. Okay. Certainly the sociologists in the room might have something to say about culture. Let me start to add things and others can flesh out the definition. And okay, so Missy says that it's something different from community. Absolutely. Nicole Rivera, implicit beliefs, explicit behaviors. These are awesome. Okay, Megan says ideology, ways of thinking. Absolutely. So culture is about our way of life, and it encompasses the ways we behave, the ways we learn, the normative expectations that we have, patterns of interpersonal relationships and conduct. And culture is something that gets passed on from generation to generation. Absolutely, language is a key part of culture, and that's so relevant for our discussion today. Yeah, I like that point that Jenny makes, that it can be very much individual as well as something communal and something shared. Okay, so by expanding our cultural reach, including multicultural perspectives in our teaching, and recognizing cultural assets that students bring to the classroom, we increase the likelihood that our students will master the learning objectives. The authors of the book make a compelling case that what matters most to student learning and success and increased retention and graduation rates is faculty approaching their teaching with openness, humility, and a strengths-based approach to understanding culture. Scott, would you advance to the next slide, please? So it's been a real pleasure to work with my colleague, Dr. Jenny Shah, as we chose a book that we thought would help us better understand culturally sustaining teaching practices. And I've learned so much from Jenny throughout this conversation, and I'm excited that others are going to get to benefit today from her disciplinary expertise. So we debated quite a while about what book we wanted to feature. So Jenny, why did we ultimately choose this one?
Sure, thank you for that introduction. I've learned quite a bit working with Jen as well. So as she mentioned, we literally debated about 10 different books going back and forth for a month or two. And ultimately we chose teaching across cultural strengths, mostly because of number one, its cover. So Scott, if you would like to advance the slide, I could incorporate my answer into the next slide. So the cover of the book was very, very powerful. Each symbol depicted a different concept of strength from a different culture. So you have Polynesian culture depicted, you have Japanese culture, and then for me, what stood out was really the Om symbol, from Hinduism, which I don't often see on the materials that I read in education. The Om symbol isn't featured on a lot of the books that I have in my home library or in my office library. So when I saw that symbol, it really appealed to me. And the second reason we chose it is because I think that a lot of people talk about explicit curriculum, like including authors of color in your syllabus, or covering issues that are important in your explicit syllabus. This book, however, talked about the implicit curriculum. What are kind of the hidden things that we as faculty can do to make a more inclusive environment that doesn't necessarily show up as the content on our syllabus? So we just thought that it could reach a lot more people.
Great. Scott, next slide. I want to thank the chairs of the DEI Task Force, Stephen Maynard Caliendo and Dorothy Plez, for providing us with this very reverent land acknowledgement statement. And so this might be the first that some of you are seeing it. Formal statements such as these delivered at the outset of a public presentation can help cultivate mindfulness about our place in history, and they also celebrate the resilience of Indigenous communities. So I'm going to read it aloud. This is North Central College. We would like to recognize that North Central College occupies the land of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples, past and present. We also acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. And we honor, respect, and thank the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. We recognize that grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular the erasure of indigenous and African identities, not only under slavery, but via racist laws and segregation of people in our community. We hope this acknowledgement compels those who hear it to take action and to learn more about indigenous and African cultures and our nation's troubling past. We pause now to celebrate this ancestral land of the Council of Three Fires, remember people who have faced violence and exclusion in our community, and stand in solidarity with those who continue to battle hatred and racism today. Next slide, Scott. The authors of this book provide us with extensive biographical notes. So I want to tell you a little bit about what brought them to this work. So for Alicia Fedelina Chavez, equity among college students is for her, quote, purely and simply about a responsibility I feel for the learning and success of all of our students. Chavez is mestiza, a mixing of Spanish and Native American cultures from the time her ancestors began to intermarry in the late 1500s in what is now New Mexico. Some of her students of Northern European descent have challenged her over her career, her ways of teaching, and very direct, and what she describes as sometimes belligerent, cruel, and even highly inappropriate ways. One student complained to the provost, who pointed out to the student that he was very privileged to be learning in new ways that would assist him as he negotiated in a global society. The Office of Accessibility introduced Chavez to Gardner's theories of multiple intelligences and explained that teaching across intelligences would help all of her students learn better. This changed her life as a teacher, inspiring her to more systematically design courses to facilitate learning more effectively across cultures. Susan Longerbeam is of Northern European Caucasian descent, raised in San Francisco, California in the 60s and 70s. She says that her family taught her that individuals striving would lift them from the middle class to a better life. And her work is driven by questions such as, what are more possibilities, more ways to teach and learn? What are the learning and life experiences that encourage openness to diversity? So each of the authors works from contrasting ends of the cultural continuum, and both are striving for educational equity. And they reflect on what has made their cross-cultural collaboration possible is their willingness to challenge one another with questions and to share insights about their cultured selves. So they ask each other, why do you do it that way? Explain how doing things this way is helpful to you. Witt, 1993, describes this as making the familiar strange, a process of studying something in our everyday lives as though we were visitors in a foreign land. Next slide. I also wanted to include this quote from Chavez just to give you a sense of the writing in the book. She writes, I teach with the strengths of my mother and my grandmothers, searching for interconnectedness and relationships among ideas, places, events, and people. I teach with the strength of my father and grandfathers, facilitating learning through experiences of doing, reflecting, simulating, and imagining. Next slide.
So we have identified 4 objectives for today. We believe it's good practice for us to really know what we're getting into before we get into it. So the first objective is to begin to understand how our own collective and individual culture manifests itself in our teaching practices, and to discuss why that matters in our current context. So basically, how does who you are as a learner affect how you teach? How does who you are as a teacher affect how you teach? I also want to share with you, I'm wearing a shirt made by my maternal grandmother. This is called a jablu, and it was hand sewn by my maternal grandmother, probably when I was about 15 years old, and it's very traditional Persian. So I wanted to share that I'm wearing something from my grandmother to me, made for me, and I'm channeling her energy as I do this presentation. The second objective is to learn about differing cultural frameworks that influence teaching and learning in our classrooms and on campus. So perhaps you've heard about one side of the framework, perhaps you haven't heard about the other. We want to try to explore both sides of the framework today. The third objective is to begin to strategize a balance between cultural strengths in our courses, our relationships with students, and within ourselves. So the key is balance. Fourth, to learn from each other in how we design our courses and our syllabi, to share all of our pedagogical strengths, and to find the collective support in order to do so. Nobody should do this work alone, and I think that there are some wonderful faculty who have joined us today collectively. We hope to learn from them. We hope to share our knowledge with them, and hopefully you will walk away with some good takeaways from today. Oh, so today we will cover, sorry. So today there are several chapters of the book. There are actually, in fact, 8 chapters of the book. And when Jen and I talked, we believed strongly that we wanted to emphasize chapters 1 and 6, and then sort of give an overview to chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's the format we'll follow today. We'll emphasize the learning in chapter 1. Then Jen will talk a little bit about what the content is in chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then I will come back and talk a little bit more about pedagogy and how I applied chapter 6 to my own courses. Chapters 7 and 8 are more about institutional change, in the sense that they kind of outline what they've done at their own organizations and institutions. And so we figured with the time that we had, this is going to be our agenda for today.
So take a look at this continuum here. It's a quick overview of what characterizes an individuated culture compared to an integrated culture, right? So a range from private to interconnected, from compartmentalized to mutual, individualized to reflexive, contextually independent to contextually dependent. The authors write, ultimately balancing across cultural frameworks would mean that we engage the cultural strengths of every student in our teaching practices to enrich student learning overall. Next slide. Let me share with you these quotes, which I think illustrate very effectively about how we can feel outside of our cultural element, or how we can feel very comfortable, as the first student writes. My education experience have always felt comfortable to me. I learned the same basic way that my teachers and professors teach. This is from a Scandinavian American math student. Contrast that with, I feel like that old song about having to leave my face in a jar by the door when I leave for class. I feel like I have to pretend to be someone else, someone I don't really know how to be, and it all feels so unnatural to me. I was taught that learning is meant to be complex, interconnected, and whole, but my college courses are separated and so focused on the abstract that I get lost in spending time learning facts, figures, theory, and equations, seemingly without their meaning in engineering or in life, from a Spanish-American mechanical engineering student. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is kind of the meat of the entire book. The entire book focuses specifically on this table. So Jen and I thought we would spend some time kind of dissecting this particular table and what the authors say about it. So if you look to the middle, you will see 8 different constructs that the authors lay out. So those are purpose of learning, ways of taking in and processing knowledge, the interconnectedness of what is being learned, the responsibility for learning, time, role of the teacher, student interactions, and the sequencing. So those are kind of the 8 main constructs that they ask for faculty to think about along the continuum. So on the left side of the continuum, you see the individuated answers, and on the right side of the continuum, you see the integrated answers. Now again, we want to emphasize this is a continuum. And there are no right or wrong answers here. You could be more integrated on one concept, but more individuated on the other. So you can kind of be on the continuum in various ways for each of the different 8 constructs. So Jen, did you want to go into the first 4, or did you want me to talk about the first 4?
I think we're going to do that in the breakout, right?
Oh, right. So if you have any questions, or kind of maybe take a minute to look this chart over. We also want to mention that we have created a document in the box folder, which I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the link here in our chat feature. And if you click on that link, you'll be taken to our box folder. And in that box folder, there is a teaching across cultural strength. So it'll say TACS, and then it'll say handout. It might be great to go ahead and go into that box folder and download the handout. It'll be immensely helpful for the rest of this session.
And next slide, Scott.
Okay, so in the first breakout session, we're going to focus on ourselves as learners. How does who I am affect how I learn? That's kind of the big question that we're trying to answer. So you will be broken up. I believe Scott is going to try to do 4 people to a room. I don't know how many we have. I haven't looked at the numbers, but we're going to try to get 4 people in a room. And what you're going to do is you're going to introduce yourself and tell us about the origin of your name. So for example, for me, I was born in India, and my parents, when I was born, had this dream, right? This American dream to eventually be here in the United States. And so in 1982, the year I was born, Jennifer was actually the #1 name in the United States. And so my dad thought to himself, you know, if I give her this name, it might open more opportunities for her if we do end up going to the United States. And I will tell you that my father's hunch was 100% correct. I hated that my name was Jennifer for a very long time because I didn't get a Persian name like everybody else in my family. And people generally ask me, is that your real name? Yes, Jennifer is in fact my real name. And I benefit a lot from it because I create connections because of my name all over, and even on this NCC campus because of my name. So you want to share a little bit about the origin of your name. Perhaps you're named after a grandmother, or perhaps your parents really liked a particular TV show. Whatever it is, share that with your group. And then in your breakout session, choose one of the top 4 in the table that we just described. So choose either purpose of learning, ways of taking in and processing knowledge, the interconnectedness of what is being learned, or the responsibility of learning. Read it over in the chart, and then talk about, as a learner, where do you feel you fall on this continuum? So as a learner, not as a teacher, as a learner, where do you fall on the continuum? And that's what we'll be discussing in breakout sessions. I believe we said 10 minutes for this one. Is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome. And all of that's in the chat feature as well. Thank you, Jen.
So Scott's going to put us into groups of 4 to have this 2-part conversation of sharing our names and then thinking about where we fall on the continuum as a learner in the first 4 rows. And then we'll shift to our role as teachers and look at the next 4 rows in a subsequent breakout. Okay. Go ahead, Scott.
Okay, I'm going to push the button. This may sting a bit. Okay, so you should be getting an invitation to join your room. Go ahead and do that. Hi, Supna. We have people in breakout rooms right now. They are talking to each other about their the origins of their names and some other things. So I am going to go ahead and assign you to one of those rooms, to breakout room 2, so that you can just join that conversation, and that's what they're doing right now. So you should be getting an invitation to join that room. Okay, we should be coming back.
Yeah.
It's like we got 20 seconds before they all absolutely shut down.
Okay.
People should be wandering back in.
And then I definitely couldn't see the table while we were away, but it helped to have the box link to be able to go to it, because we're going to immediately go to another breakout room.
Do you want the next slide?
Yeah, can you advance? It's actually slide 13. Yeah, breakout discussion group 2. Thank you. Is everybody back now, Scott?
I think so.
Okay, awesome. So we're immediately going to go into a second breakout room, and we'll put you with some different people this time. I think that's possible. And we want you to look at the bottom rows of the table. So in my group, we were able to use the link and go and pull that up. It's in a set of handouts. It's on page 5 of the handout package in there if you want to pull up. To talk about along the continuum, now we want you to think about how who you are affects how you teach. And we'll talk about either time, the role of the teacher, student interactions, or sequencing. And I don't know if Jenny's back yet from...
I'm back.
Okay, Jenny, do you want to just do 5 minutes for this breakout group?
Yeah, let's make it really quick. And again, you're just choosing one area, just one of these 4. And we want the whole group to discuss the one area. So, you know, just somebody right as you get in there, just throw out, you know, I really like, let's talk about time or role of the teacher. Just throw it out as soon as you get in, and we'll have 5 minutes to talk about it.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Scott. You want to breakout room us again?
Yep.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. My group had a really interesting conversation about time. We're going to move on to talk about the chapters in the middle of the book. I'm going to give a quick overview of those, but we'll be having some opportunity for larger conversation. Jenny, did you want to do any other follow-up on this activity at this point, or should we move on?
No, I think looking at the time, I think we should probably keep going. And then if we finish up, then I would love to bring everybody back together and just kind of say, you know, remembering about our breakout groups, you know, would anybody like to share some specific examples? We can save time for that at the end.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Next slide, Scott. So as Jenny said, we like to try to give a roadmap of the book in case you want to continue your journey, delve more deeply into a particular chapter. So I'm going to share some quick highlights on chapters 2 through 5. Chapter 2 examines the role of culture in college teaching, and the authors try to shift our focus from cultural deficits, which is often dominating the conversation, to celebrating cultural strengths. The final section of this chapter spotlights, based on research, the strengths of 5 different racial ethnic groups in the United States and ways that we can tap into those strengths in our pedagogical design, teaching, and mentoring practices. And they emphasize that this broad outline of cultural strengths is by no means meant to substitute for learning about each student as an individual. I'll give you a couple of illustrations. The research on Latina and Latino American cultural strengths, some of the values we see are perseverance, interpersonal and emotional intelligence, affection, loyalty, respect for others, respect for elders, commitment to family, spirituality, faith, and bilingualism. And then you'll hear some overlaps when you look at the strengths of that have been identified among African American cultures, include extended family support and cohesion, spiritual and religious devotion, commitment to life balance, flexible gender roles, survival skills, and ethnic pride. So Chavez and Longerbeam encourage increasing visibility of culture among faculty so that we can better meet students in their own worlds. Next slide, Scott. In chapter 3, as we're seeking to balance integrated and individuated frameworks, the authors recommend keeping these core principles in mind. So you'll have access to this slide later if you want to learn more about these particular principles. So being accessible, more important than ever right now as we are in this hybrid sort of learning environment or fully online. Being willing to share different parts of your background, embracing vulnerability, seeing yourself as a learning partner on the student's educational journey. After it goes through these core principles in the chapter, that concludes by talking about potential hazards that we might encounter as we seek to enact these principles in our teaching. Pushback, discomfort. We have to be careful to avoid essentializing tendencies and stereotypes. And that is, by doing that, we're going to be more likely to have a long-term transformation as a teacher. And the book repeatedly circles back to what the rewards of this work are that will help us sustain our commitment to these practices. The rewards are many. Students are going to learn more, they're going to succeed at greater rates, and that's going to be both professionally and personally enriching. The last one on the list here of principles, practicing suspending judgment about students, particularly about their level of effort and commitment to learning. So we're going to have a breakout conversation where we'll revisit this principle and think about a potentially problematic student behavior and how we might interpret it in different ways. Next slide, Scott. Chapter 4, again, is a quick overview. I just want to share a few thoughts. The authors write, knowing students more deeply and culturally as faculty is helpful to understanding students in their learning, and it's also helpful for gaining a better sense of how students experience our communications and teaching practices. So the authors recommend the things that I've listed here on the slide to learn more about your students. So inviting them to have deeper conversations, to bring this chart that we've been engaging with into the classroom as a model, as a conversation starter with students, reading about particular cultural populations, incorporating different campus professionals into your class. So people across the campus who are knowledgeable about this. And then Jenny's going to share with you an example that she uses in her course to learn culturally about her students.
Thank you, Jen. So in my EDUC 101 class, which is introduction, kind of the foundations of teaching and learning, one of the first theories we learn about is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And so what I ask them to do is to write me a paper based on those intelligences. I do ask them to tell me about the strengths of the theory and critique the theory, but then I also ask them to tell me about their strengths as a learner. Are they bodily kinesthetic learners? Give me an example where that type of learning worked for you. Are you an interpersonal learner and you learn by talking with others, working with others? Are you an intrapersonal learner and you need that time for reflection before you can jump into the conversation? So what they do is they write a how I learn paper. The second paragraph talks about their strengths. The third paragraph talks about challenges and how certain types of learning have not worked for them in the past. And then in the last paragraph, they give me strategies that they think would work in EDUC 101. And then I try to incorporate those strategies as best as I can into my entire course. So I try to hit on a lot of different areas of the multiple intelligences. So like if one day we're doing something, well, obviously not during the pandemic, but if one day we're doing something that's involving a lot of moving around in my classroom, the next day we might do something that involves a lot of self-reflection. And so to kind of pace that along. But in the paper, I learn so much about every single one of my students. I learn about their likes, I learn about their dislikes, I learn about their faith, I learn about their culture, individual and communal. This paper is like gold to me. And I spend about like a week or so reading their papers, taking notes on their papers, and then trying to incorporate the knowledge from their papers into my teaching. And you can just see sometimes, like, for example, I'll read a paper and then I'll pull up something that a student said, 2 weeks down the road or 3 weeks down the road, and they just immediately light up as to like, wow, she remembered that about me. And that's important to her about how I learn. So I can share, I'm not sure if I did in the Google Drive or in the Box Drive already, but I can share the actual assignment of the How I Learn paper, and then also an example of a paper that a student submitted with their name removed, so that you can kind of see what kind of richness comes out of an assignment like this. Now, of course, this is tailored to education, right? This is tailored to my EDUC 101 class, but you could certainly do something different. Like there's a true colors inventory online that students can take, and you can use that. There's a variety of ways that you can learn about your students at the beginning of a course. That was just my quick little example.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful example because the students are also learning so much about themselves, right? They're engaged in this metacognitive reflection, and that's going to be beneficial for their learning. Okay, next slide, Scott. In chapter 5, the authors point out that college classrooms that cater to only one type of cultural learning, that this is a contributing factor to differential learning rates and college success rates between cultural populations. Verns Turner, 1994, describes this as being similar to being a guest in someone else's house whose pictures are not on the wall, whose traditions are not present. So you feel out of your element. You certainly don't feel at home or a sense of belonging. Chavez and Longerbeam suggest getting started by conceptualizing, that we think about content dissemination should not be the only factor driving our course design, that we must consider process-based learning, where knowledge dissemination moves from being a focal point to something that's more balanced with the learning goals that we're trying to achieve, and working interactively with students, checking in with them for understanding. And then we must reimagine our teaching and student learning and changing our approaches whenever necessary. Research shows that learning, success, and retention are elevated at colleges and universities where faculty widely believed that they held the responsibility for student learning, success, and retention. Starting where students are developmentally means taking into account the diversity of cultures in our classrooms, socioeconomic statuses, nationalities, familial and work responsibilities, and other identity dimensions. We had Sia Verschelden, the author of talking about the bandwidth that students have that eats up all of these different kinds of things, being part of a minoritized community. It's all of that sensitivity that we have to who our students are as learners, and thinking about the cultural capital that they're bringing or that they do not have, that enables them to navigate the expectations of higher education. So things that we can do to help pull back the curtain on the hidden curriculum and enable our students to navigate the environment without sanction or assistance. This is particularly important with first-gen college students, things that we can do to enhance their cultural capital. You can learn more about that in chapter 5. And I want to share two, you can go on to the next one. I want to share 2 quotes from the chapter that really stood out to me. The first was that syllabi can act as one of the first indicators of care, cultural balance, and learning in a college course. And from a student perspective, I know in the first session whether a professor cares and wants me to learn and succeed in their class. It's in the syllabus and the way they talk to us and whether or not they're interested in us. Or just what they are teaching. I'll drop a class and add one that is much more tougher to learn with a professor who cares. You can go on to the next slide. And Jenny's gonna take us to chapter 6, which I think is the most exciting chapter in the book.
So chapter 6 really gets into pedagogy. So we talked about theory, right? We talked about this continuum. We talked about integrated cultures, individuated cultures. I'll get into some very specific examples in just a minute, but I want you to think about this for a second. I have attended school in the United States from 2nd grade through 12th grade. I did my undergraduate work at Indiana University in Bloomington, my master's at Loyola University in Chicago, and my doctorate at Loyola University in Chicago. This is a span of 25 years that I was in school. 25 years, a variety of teachers, a variety of core subjects. I have never had one Desi teacher in my whole life. And by Desi, I mean Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, Nepalese. I never had one Desi teacher in the 25 years that I have been in school. But I did have teachers who saw me, who felt me, who heard me, who understood my cultures, would wish me a happy Diwali and actually understand what would be going on in my home that weekend, or would actually point out things related to my home life because they had researched them, or because they took the time to talk to my grandmother or my mother, who were primarily responsible for my care. So I constantly think to myself, obviously, as a college professor, I'm not going to call up somebody's grandmother or somebody's mother, but there are ways for me to kind of channel what my teachers did for me in my collegiate classroom. And when I read this chapter, it just rang home for me. I just believe that all 10 of these are really super important. We don't have time to discuss every single one. So we've decided, Jen and I talked and we said, we're gonna highlight these 3 for now, but there is a separate video and in the box drive that has a video of about 30 some minutes of me talking about all 10 and how they relate to my specific courses. So Scott, if we can begin with the first slide, please. So the first thing that Chavez and Longerbeam talk about is to really self-reflect culturally. There are some really great quotes here. I'm going to move my screen a little bit because I can't seem to see the whole thing because of everybody's pictures. So let me move that. I wasn't turning the lens back on myself. Self-reflection was an eye-opener and made me more patient. Identifying personal values and beliefs and reflecting on their origins in our lives is helpful to understanding ourselves and to consider differing values and beliefs among students in our courses. So really for us as faculty to sit down and really think about, who am I and how does that affect how I teach? What are my core cultural values and my values related to education, and how do those play out in my courses? I had an awesome opportunity to do this about a year ago when North Central did their TEDx event last year. And I had the opportunity to really think about, why do I teach the way that I teach? You know, why am I a social justice educator? And how does that play out for me? Sometimes it plays out in negative ways. Sometimes it plays out in positive ways. But that self-reflection really helped me to understand better why I teach what I teach. And in my line of education, it's very important to share with the teacher candidates why I'm teaching the way that I'm teaching. So it allowed me to elaborate on that for my students. The Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Task Force, sometime last year, I can't remember when, passed out a sheet about microaggressions. And I would really suggest kind of sitting with that sheet, being honest with yourself about that sheet, and kind of saying, you know, what are my actions? What actions have I taken towards students? What can I do better? What can I keep in mind? And then to keep coming back to the cultural continuum to see what you can change. And then sit with your syllabus and say to yourself, throughout my entire syllabus, what points are hitting on the integrated side and what points are hitting on the individuated side. I also want to say, this is the last thing I'll say for this slide. In the box folder, there is a PowerPoint called the 8-word autoethnography. This is something I did with the Honors Salon series just yesterday. And what you do is you really think about words that you would use to describe yourself. And then you take a selfie and imagine what a stranger would say about you the first time they were meeting you. And how does that play into power and privilege? The second part of that activity asks you to identify 8 words about yourself related to race, ethnicity, nationality, etc. And then kind of talk about which roles do you have power in and which roles could possibly marginalize you because you identify in those categories. So I highly suggest, if you have time, or maybe you attended the Honor Salon series yesterday, so thank you if you did that. But go into the box folder and just look at that particular PowerPoint and sit with yourself and answer those same questions. So self-reflecting culturally was something that was very emphasized in chapter 6. Scott, if we could move on, please. So this one is a little bit harder to do, honestly. Exploring one negative attribution. So you want to choose one way in which you tend to judge your students negatively. And for me, the example was silence. When I first became a faculty member, an adjunct faculty member at North Park University, I would get really frustrated when I would ask a question and then there would be crickets from my students. Because how dare you not immediately answer my question, right? So for me, silence was something I really needed to sit with and say, why can't I respect silence? And I also sometimes tend to like jump into conversations, sometimes talk over people. It's not because I'm trying to be disrespectful, it's just that's how talk happens in my home. That's how talk happens in my community, is everybody kind of jumps into the conversation and it's this like connected conversation. So for me, that pause of giving everybody their space, that respect of silence, that was really hard for me, but I had to chip away at that blind spot because that's what master teachers do, according to the book. Master teachers chip away at their blind spots. They figure out one population they were not reaching. They learn more about that population, and then they move on to the next one, so that over the span of a year, they're learning about a variety of different populations. One pedagogical strategy in education that has worked really well for me is called wait time times 2. And so basically what that means is once a student responds, you don't automatically respond as the faculty member. You wait and you have a second or a third student respond before you synthesize their answers and feed them back to the class. So it's not student, teacher, student, teacher, student, teacher all the time. It's sort of like student, 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 teacher, student, 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 teacher, so that you're increasing student voice in your classroom. And then it talks about having a growth mindset. So allowing for students to redo work in order to learn from their mistakes, instead of just kind of putting an assignment to the side and not coming back to it, or even perhaps not even looking at the feedback. I make my students look at the feedback. And essentially what I say is, you will do this over. Like, there is no ifs, ands, or buts. I don't want an average teacher for my children. I want a teacher in the front of the room that has an A in their coursework, right, for my children. And I would want that for all children. Every child deserves an amazing teacher. And so either you will get an A or a B in my class, or you will fail and find a different profession. There are no average teachers graduating from my classroom. So having that growth mindset to kind of say, like, can we work with this student? Can we help them improve? Can we do this 3 or 4 times? And then at the end of 3 or 4 times, if the student still isn't getting it, then it's, you know, really time for a conversation. So I'm not saying I let everybody through. I'm just simply saying, let's give students more of a chance to show us that they can learn. So a few quotes from the book to wrap up this slide. We found that many faculty we worked with who had also moved away from evaluating students' learning, which in many ways felt like judging the students, to working with students until they learned. I am still amazed with how many students work incredibly hard to revise their assignments, and they are always grateful for the opportunity. I have students who have done assignments over again 4 to 5 times for me in my courses. And that's, you know, they do other assignments in the meantime, but they will do this one over and over again until they get what I need them to get from this particular assignment. So Scott, if you could move to the next slide, please. So I just have a quick example for you of what I am talking about. I am using a pseudonym for one of my students. She's a wonderful teacher candidate. And she tried her first try at an assignment called Funds of Knowledge. Funds of Knowledge is a term that we use in education for teachers to know about the home lives of their students. And again, that cultural capital plays a role. So what I do in my EDUC 101 class is I have them exchange their assignments with each other. So they do the assignment at home, they bring it in, a peer is assigned to them, and they review each other's assignments using the same rubric that I would use to grade. So the peer gives them feedback using the rubric, gives them a grade, and then they go home and revise the assignment. Tammy's first try was terrible. It was just terrible. I think that her peer gave her a 5 out of 12 on that assignment. So then she went home and she tried a second time on that assignment, and then she turned it in to me. And now I assess the assignment with the same rubric. Now here's the catch in my class. If my score ends up being lower than what your peer assessor gave to you, not only do you lose those points, but those points come off for the peer as well, because they should have caught that on the rubric. Now, if it's something that's really in the gray area, I don't push it too much. But if it's something very clear that the peer assessor missed, then they're going to lose a point as much as Tammy. So Tammy did it the second time, and I caught something very small that, you know, the peer assessor couldn't have caught at their level. And so I explained it to Tammy. She did it a third time, and the third time she walked away with a 12 out of 12 on her assignment. But that's not the important part. The important part is that she fully understood why funds of knowledge of her students are important for a teacher to understand. She could define funds of knowledge, give examples about them, and I could just go on and on. But overall, Tammy walked away having a much more sophisticated understanding about a very important topic because she was forced to do the assignment 3 times. So just something to think about. We can't do this with every assignment, but maybe just the important ones, the very, very important ones, because all of our assignments are important. The very, very important ones, this is a growth mindset that we can possibly think about. Scott, if we could move on, please. Okay, I do see there are some things being said in the chat feature as well. I love that. So please do comment in the chat feature as much as you like, and maybe at the end we can come on back to some of those. So one of the things that stood out to me in chapter 6, I believe very strongly in making a personal connection. So I say to my students all the time, you cannot teach whom you do not know. And this year we're actually going to make a t-shirt. So if you see it around campus, I hope you will know what we're talking about. So you cannot teach whom you do not know. So quotes from the book. One way to get to know students and relate to students' lives is by explaining concepts using social media, current events, and pop culture. Some students are more likely than others to share their personal hopes and challenges, often trying to make a connection with their professors. So I try to be up on what the students are doing. I spent my summer trying to learn TikTok. I don't even want to go into that right now. But I try to do my best to understand, what are they watching? You know, what are they Netflix binging on? What are the social media apps that they're really into right now? And what is trending on those social media apps? I try to be aware of those kinds of things so that either I can incorporate it into my teaching, or I can make some sort of joke or side comments to let them know that I do care about what they're doing outside of the classroom. So a couple of other examples on how to do this, specifically from EDUC 101, is on the first day of class, we don't even say the word syllabus. We don't talk about the syllabus. We do talk about the required text, but other than that, we don't talk about the syllabus. What we do is the artifact museum activity. And so what I ask students to do is to pretend that they're the subject of an exhibit at the Field Museum. What 3 artifacts would museum goers see and learn about them by going to their exhibit? So they bring their artifacts to the first class. Sometimes it's just a picture on their phone. I do the same thing. In fact, I often wear this same shirt to share. And then I also tell them, you may include pictures, but one of your artifacts has to be cultural. So this activity really helps my students see that there's a lot of similarities between many of them. So many of them will say, you know, my background is Irish, or many of them will bring a baseball and say, I'm on the baseball team at North Central College, and find another student who is on the baseball team, and immediately they have that connection. So I do that on the first day. Much further into the course, I play a song, Gotta Have High Hopes. You can see the links are here for another time if you want to explore them. But we talk about Tara Yoso's forms of cultural capital, and I use a song actually to do the assessment. So we play the song, which is like a mainstream song, and they evaluate the lyrics for where they think that Tara Yoso's 6 forms of capital are embedded into the song. And it's a really fun activity. And then what they do is called an I have capital assignment. So they look at Tara Yoso's forms of capital, and then they identify their own forms of capital in those 6. So specific examples of their own forms of capital that they bring to the classroom, because everybody has capital. And then finally, I'll share one more example on the next slide, but I use a show called Mixedish. It's from abc.com, and it's a spin-off of a show called Blackish. And it talks about a mixed race family, primarily growing up in the 1980s, I believe. And I use certain episodes to discuss identity and culture from a mainstream show. And it has seen a lot of positive reactions from the students. So those are just examples from my classroom. If we go to the next slide, Scott, we can see, I know it's really hard to see that. It's actually quite blurry, so I apologize. But these are examples from the I Have Cultural Capital assignment. So all of these responses are anonymous, so you don't see student names, just for their own privacy. But one of the comments on there, so the question asks, what aspirational capital do you possess, and where does that drive come from? And one of my students talked about his children, and that his drive, his aspirational capital comes from kind of showing his children that he can achieve a certain status, or he can learn and become a teacher and change the world. So after I read this, it was actually right around Veterans Day, and I bought a book called H is for Honor. and he is a veteran. Actually, I believe he's graduated now. And I actually took the book and I created like a little insert in there. I knew his children's names by that point. We had several conversations about his children after he posted this in the I Have Capital assignment. I got a book called H is for Honor, and I wrote it to his children. You know, dear so-and-so and so-and-so, as the teacher of your dad, I'm so very proud of him. He's achieved this, 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 and this. And I really want to honor him today on Veterans Day. And I'm so grateful for the service he's provided our country. And I just, you know, wrapped it up and gave it to him. And this was a student that I actually did not get along with. He and I butted heads hardcore at the very beginning of class. And it took a lot of time for us to build a relationship. And by the end of the course, we really would cry with each other. We would talk with each other, not just about our children, but just about, you know, the course or larger things going on in the world. And this is somebody who I'm now going to keep in touch with for a very long time. And it all started with this one comment on this one assignment. I didn't know he had kids, but this assignment allowed me to kind of figure it out. So he did later identify that that was his comment, and that's how I kind of pieced it together. So these are ways that we can learn more about our students. So Scott, the next slide, please.
Okay. I think we have time for doing one more breakout session. So Jenny and I are very aware that our disciplines of sociology and education lend themselves to these kinds of conversations. And those of you coming from STEM backgrounds might be wondering, what are your next steps? How can you think about your own disciplinary perspectives and how those tie into the ways in which you teach, and whether you could expand your teaching more broadly across cultural frameworks in your particular subject area. So we'll go into groups again for about 5 minutes, kind of thinking about that disciplinary lens, but really getting at the final question about the action steps that you would like to take now, what you will do with the information that we shared today, what more you would like to learn. Jenny, anything else before we go into this last breakout? Okay, so I'll see you back here in 5 minutes, and I'll post these questions in the chat to make it easier for you to reference. That was over too soon for our for our conversation, but I hope you got a chance to at least begin to reflect on these questions and your next action steps. And then Jenny's going to wrap us up with some additional things that you might consider. Oh, Jenny.
Thank you. If we could go to the next slide, Scott, we'd really love for people to type into the chat feature, you know, what further actions would you like to take communally that we can perhaps set up. There is a group, I forgot the date off the top of my head. I want to say it's September 18th, but we have a collaborative colleagues group that is going to meet to talk a little bit more about, you know, inclusion in our classroom and our strategies. So we can send that information out. Megan Cole-Pashtian is leading that group, and there are a handful of us already in the group. So if you're interested, you can certainly reach out to me, or you can reach out to Megan Cole-Pashtian, and she can add you to the group. So we want to direct your attention to this next slide, which has a lot of additional resources from our NCC box folder. So what you'll find there is the PowerPoint presentation that you're viewing right now, and you can click on all of the bells and whistles that went with this PowerPoint presentation. It's not the entire chapter of the book, but it is what is freely and readily available online from Teaching Across Cultural Strengths. I want to say it's the first 20 pages or so, just to get you a flavor of the book. The third thing that you'll find in there is the handout, which hopefully you already downloaded. The fourth thing you'll find is the extension video. So if you're interested in that chapter 6 and learning more about those 10 things that we can all do as faculty that are not specific to our academic area. You can view my video there. I will say it's completely unedited. It is a video that I made for my class, so it's about 30 some minutes long, but it'll give you a sense of what those other things were that we didn't get a chance to talk about. Then I encourage you to look at that extension activity, which is the 8-word autoethnography PowerPoint. This is something you can do with others. This is something you can do alone, but I think it really helps us think through our own identity and our positionality. And then finally, we left it with an open mind graphic organizer. So this is just a quick little, it's literally just an open head on a page. And you can use that open mind graphic organizer as you're exploring some of these resources to jot down any ideas that you have, the feelings that you have, the questions that you have, and then you can certainly reach out to me or to Jen to keep the conversation going on some of these things on our campus. So those are all found in the NCC box folder called Teaching Across Cultural Strengths Extensions. We could go to the next slide, please. So finally, we wanted to leave you with something to kind of chew on, something to think about as you're leaving. So we encourage you to sit with the cultural framework, and for each of the different 8 constructs, place an X along the continuum where you believe you are in how you teach, and then reflect on the following questions. Given where you are on the continuum, what are some of your most distinctive values and priorities related to teaching? Do you fall mostly on the integrated side, mostly on the individuated side? Is it kind of a mix and match of both of those things? From where in your life and identities do these values and priorities originate? Something to think about. How might a student with a cultural framework dissimilar to your experience your courses in contrast to a student with a similar cultural framework? So if you fall on the individuated side, how would an integrated learner take in your course? And how could you include an integrated learner more into your courses? And when you do that inclusion, what does that mean for student learning? And obviously, it could be very positive for student learning. So these are just some things that you can do individually, kind of walking away from this presentation, just to get the ball rolling on teaching across cultural strengths.
We were delighted to have such thoughtful engagement today, that this a book, I think, clearly attracted a lot of interest, and there's so much more in terms of the collaborative colleagues that Jenny was talking about. I see some people express an interest in that, and we'll ask Megan to share information about how you can join that group that was just sort of organically formed with people wanting to do some follow-up to our previous diversity, equity, and inclusion series, as well as our wonderful opening week speaker, Dr. Sumi Pendekar, and her talk about fierce imagination and being radically inclusive in our pedagogy. So thank you all. I know we're at the end of our time, and we really appreciated you being with us today. And there will be a recording of this session as well. So if any of your colleagues were unable to attend, please let them know that they can contact CAFE, and we'll be happy to share this presentation. Thank you so much, Jenny, for bringing this book to our campus community.
Thank you, Jen, for the opportunity.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.